Today, as we continue our series on stories of faith, we're looking at the story of Ruth. And her story is found near the beginning of the Old Testament in the book of Ruth. But we're not going to read the whole book this morning, so let me give you a bit of an overview. The book begins with a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their two sons. And at the time in Judah there is a famine. So Elimelech and his family leave their home in Bethlehem in the kingdom of Judah and they go to live in the nearby country of Moab. Now, not long afterwards, Elimelech dies, and then a little later on his sons die too. Naomi is left with her two daughters-in-law, and in her grief she decides to go back home to Judah. Now, one of her daughters-in-law, a woman named Ruth, who's from Moab, tells Naomi that she will go with her. She makes an incredible promise to Naomi, telling her, "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Together, Ruth and Naomi travel back to the land of Judah, and while there, Ruth meets a man named Boaz, who is a distant relative of Naomi's husband. Boaz takes pity on Ruth and makes sure that she and Naomi are cared for. Later, Boaz agrees to marry Ruth so that she and Naomi will be under his protection. Ruth and Boaz have children together, and in time we learn they are the great-grandparents of King David. Ruth's story has lots of things to teach us, but today our focus is on God's provision. So, let's hear a little of Ruth's story now, and we're going to read from chapter 2, verses 1 to 19. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favour." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she came, and she's been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I've ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessel and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favour in your sight, that you should take notice of me, when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favour in your sight, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Then, when she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves. Do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she'd gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had eaten. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she'd worked, and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." So, Ruth and Naomi have left Moab, the country they've been living in, and they've left with virtually nothing. They don't have jobs or a source of income, and they're on their own. Although Naomi does have relatives living nearby, she seems reluctant to ask for help. Perhaps because being in such a situation was embarrassing and humiliating. So although she has this relative, she doesn't seem to have mentioned it to Ruth. We know this because of what it says in verse 19. Naomi says to Ruth, "Where did you work today? Whose field did you go to?" In other words, Naomi hasn't sent Ruth off to Boaz for help. She just allows Ruth to go and look for food and help wherever she can find it. So Ruth and Naomi are in a difficult situation, with nobody, it seems, to help them, but God is on their side. God has a plan, and God has things under control. We get a hint of this in verse 3. Ruth hasn't been told which field to go to, but the writer says that Ruth happened to come to the field belonging to Boaz. She happens to come to the field of a man who is both wealthy and also upright and godly. She happens to come to the field of a man who treats his employees well and who looks out for the needs of those who are less well off. She happens to come to the field of a man who just happens to be a distant relative, one of the few people who can help her, and more importantly, who is willing to help her. That is a lot of coincidences. And the writer is trying to get us to read between the lines and see that she doesn't just happen to come to this field. She comes to this field because God is in control. And throughout the story of Ruth, we see other examples of God's provision. God caring for and providing for his people, making sure that they have what they need. So, let's have a look at some of the things that God provides. One important thing that we see God provide in this story is protection. Boaz tells his men to make sure that Ruth is kept safe. Nobody is to harm her or hassle her or trouble her in any way. More than that though, Boaz's men are not just told to ignore her and leave her to her own devices. Boaz effectively tells them to keep an eye on her, and he asks them to do things to make her life easier by pulling out some sheaves for her and leaving them deliberately for her to pick up. Now, we might think all of this is happening because Boaz is a nice man, or because he's taken a bit of a fancy to Ruth. Given what happens later on when he marries her, I guess we can assume that Boaz does indeed have a soft spot for Ruth. But if we look at verse 12, Boaz himself makes it clear that Ruth's protection is not down to him and his kindness, but it comes from God. Ruth, Boaz says, is being given shelter under the wings of God himself. And what we see here is an example of the grace of God. Ruth is surprised by the kindness she receives because she doesn't feel that she deserves it. She's a foreigner, someone not included in the covenant God has made with his people. She's an outsider, and yet, because she has a humble heart, because she's turned to follow the God of Naomi, she receives God's grace. In the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 2 describes our state as being just like Ruth's. Separated from God, alienated from God's people, strangers to the promises of the covenant, having no hope, and without God in the world. Like Ruth, we haven't done anything to deserve special treatment, but as the text continues to say, now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. those of us in Christ, have been adopted into God's family, and we receive his protection and provision, just as Ruth does through Boaz in today's story. And so we see God's hand upon Ruth, keeping her safe, bringing her to the right place, bringing to fruition the plans he has for her. But we also see God's provision in the everyday things, in the basic necessities of life, like food and drink. Ruth and Naomi haven't got much money, they don't have any food, they've been travelling, so Ruth probably isn't in the best of health. She could well be weak and tired and malnourished, and she's come to the field to find food because this is her only hope. Boaz tells his men to get her water from the well, so she doesn't have to tire herself out even more pulling up the heavy bucket. He gives her some of his own food, so much so that she has all she wants and some left over to take home to Naomi. That is a picture of the generosity of God. God doesn't want to just give us enough to get by. He wants to make sure we can enjoy his generous hospitality. So when Jesus turns the water into wine, he fills huge jars with wine, even though most people have already had more than enough to drink. When he feeds the 5,000 on the hillside, there are baskets left to spare, which are gathered up for later on. And today, as we think about the harvest, think of the incredible diversity of things we have to eat. We're going to hear a little later about potatoes. Think of all the ways you can enjoy potatoes. Roast, mash, boiled, jackets, chips, crisps, croquettes, parmentier, dauphinoise if you want to be fancy. Loads of ways to enjoy that one vegetable, but God didn't give us just that one way and that one vegetable. He gave us loads of other vegetables. Boaz reminds us that God is a generous God. But there's even more in this passage about God's provision, which is important for us today. Ruth goes to the field to glean. That means she goes to pick up bits of corn that have been left at the edges of the field and not harvested. She's able to do that not because Boaz's men are lazy and they haven't done their job properly as harvesters, but because God had made a law that meant everybody had to leave space at the edge of their fields, so there was always some food left over for the foreigner, for the poor and the vulnerable. This is an incredible thing and a challenge to us today. So often today, the ethic of individuals and businesses is to take everything they can get, to use everything or to take all the resources from a particular place, leaving nothing for those who don't have anything at all. God himself writes into his rules for his people provision for the poor, the vulnerable and the needy. And it's sobering as we think about our harvest today to reflect that there is enough food in the world for everyone if we're not greedy and if we remember those rules that God lays down to make provision for some of those who are less fortunate than ourselves. This is what God asks of his people. God himself has built rules for welfare and the readjustment of society into his laws. So, God has provided Ruth with protection and with the basic necessities of life. But God is not finished yet, because the next thing God does for Ruth is bring her into the family. Now, family was a painful subject for Ruth and for Naomi. Naomi has lost her husband and her 2 sons. Ruth has lost her husband, and she's left behind the family that she has in Moab in order to support Naomi. When Ruth first insists that she'll go with Naomi, Naomi tries to put her off by saying, "I don't have any more sons for you to marry." Naomi feels that her part in family is over, and you can read of her grief and her sadness in the early part of the book of Ruth. But God has a different plan. And through Boaz, both Ruth and Naomi are brought back into a family. They enjoy all the blessings that come with that, the relationships, the sense of belonging and identity, the security, and also now being able to receive the inheritance that comes through Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Ruth becomes a mother, Naomi a grandmother, and Ruth is brought into the story of God's people. As I said earlier, Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David and an ancestor of Jesus. She starts off as an outsider, but she ends up at the heart of the story. Now, this is a significant thing, not just for Ruth and Naomi, but for all of us, because Ruth is welcomed not just into the family of Boaz, but into the family of God. This Moabite woman, this stranger from another country, is now, through the grace of God, welcomed into and included among God's people. We get here a glimpse of God's bigger plan, worked out in Jesus, to widen his family, to adopt the outsiders, and to give them a share of the inheritance. God offers us a chance to be part of that plan, part of the story, by being adopted into the family. Even though we were once outsiders and strangers to God's promises and cut off from God because of sin, as we heard in those words from Ephesians 2 earlier, through Jesus, God makes it possible for us to be his children. And so if we look around here today, we are invited to be a family together, to be in relationship with one another, to be in relationship with God, to enjoy the blessings that God has in store for his people. We're invited, like Ruth, to find a place to belong, to find identity, an identity that is rooted in God, and particularly for us, in Jesus Christ. We're invited to share in the inheritance as heirs with Jesus. We're invited, like Ruth, to make a commitment, to say, here is the God that I will follow. To say to one another, as Ruth says to Naomi, we'll travel together. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Today, in the story of Ruth, we are invited to be in the family of God. We're invited to put our faith in a God who provides. And we've seen in the story how God provides and how his hand is upon Ruth in all that she does. There are plenty more examples in the Bible of God providing for his people. Sometimes this is in dramatic, miraculous ways, and God still works like that at times today. But more often, as in the story of Ruth, we see God working through other people. God's provision for Ruth and Naomi mostly happens through the kindness of strangers. Boaz is following God's rules about leaving space at the edge of his land for the poor to gather the leftovers, and that's what makes it possible for Ruth to find food there. Imagine for a moment that Boaz was a hard-hearted, greedy, selfish man who simply took whatever he wanted without regard to anyone else. Ruth would have simply passed by that field, for there'd have been nothing for her there, and the rest of the story would have worked out very differently. God was able to work through Boaz because Boaz was a godly man, trying to follow God's rules, but more importantly, trying to follow God's heart. And because Boaz was open to God's leading, God was able to use him to bring his plans for Ruth and Naomi to fruition. Later in the story, we discover that there is a closer relative than Boaz who could have helped. Why, we might wonder, doesn't God work through him instead of Boaz? Well, we discover that though this other relative is happy to buy Naomi's land, he's not prepared to take responsibility for Ruth and Naomi and to help them in case it damages his own inheritance. This other relative is selfish at heart. Thinking only of himself and his own needs, he's closed off to God. And so God instead uses generous, godly Boaz to fulfill his plans. And so, thanks to the kindness of a stranger, the vulnerable were protected. Thanks to the kindness of a stranger, the hungry were fed. Thanks to the kindness of a stranger, God's kingdom, God's family, got bigger. Today, as we celebrate the harvest, we are thanking God for his provision. We're remembering the times when we, like Ruth, have received good things because of God's grace. But there's also a challenge for us today, to be like Boaz, to be people ready and open to being used by God. There is a challenge for us to live the kind of lives which give people the confidence to approach us, to come to us looking for protection, to come to us looking for food, whether that's physical food or spiritual food, to come to us looking for a place to belong. Across the world and here in this village, there are people who need us to be ready to share our food and our resources. There are people who need us to offer a safe space. There are people who need us to speak for them and take responsibility for them and invite them into the shelter of God's wings. Today, let's respond to God's grace to us by being channels of that grace to others. Amen.